Hello, I'm Deborah, and I am the author of the Babbage Parallel series, Reflections on the Decline of Belief in Science and Religion. I'm holding discussions on the topics covered in the series with notable experts, which brings me to our guest, Ralf Dumowitz. He's the first German to climb the 14 highest mountains, including, of course, Everest and K2. Without further ado, Ralf, hi, please do introduce yourself.
Hi, Deborah. Pleasure to see you. Pleasure to speak to your audience. My name is Ralf Dulmovich. I'm from southwestern Germany. I'm a professional mountain guide. I've been working as a mountain guide since 1987, so almost 40 years. And I think I have quite some inside view of how things are changing slowly around me in the Alps, but also in the Himalayas in Pakistan. Yeah, I've been traveling a lot in South America. I made some journeys and expeditions to Antarctica. I visited some scientific stations in Antarctica. I spoke to the scientists, how things are developing. And it's quite challenging what humanity is going to face, in my thinking. And it's already pretty late to start. Well, to start, it's pretty late to want to still change things.
Thank you so much for introducing yourself and also some of your expeditions and your research as well. What do you think has shaped mountaineering as a sport during your career?
Well, if I look back, I had a lot of these heroes from the earlier days of mountaineering, like Hermann Buhl, who made the first ascent of Nanga Parbat, like Kurt Diemberger, who first ascended two other 8,000-meter peaks. I still know pretty well about the first ascents of the big north faces in the Alps, like the Grand Jorasses North Face, Matterhorn North Face, Eiger North Face. I was happy to take part in a live broadcasting from the Eiger North Face in 1999, where, of course, we learned a lot about the history of the Eiger North Face. So this is the background which had a lot of influence on my mountaineering, but also on the style and on my ethics of mountaineering. Climbing without supplemental oxygen, not using fixed ropes, trying to climb as much as possible in Alpine style. So it was always a pretty pure way of mountaineering, a pure way of, if possible, Alpine style climbing.
Do you think, to a certain extent, as Alpine style is such a quick way of climbing, do you think that some of the overused routes are almost impossible to climb in Alpine style in peak times?
In peak times nowadays, on the normal routes on the 8,000 meters, there is almost no way of climbing Alpine style because mostly all the 8,000-meter peaks, including K2 or the third highest mountain on Earth, Mount Kanchenjunga on the border from Sikkim to Nepal, there is fixed rope almost from the base camp to the summit. That means out of these mountains was made more or less a via ferrata, which changes the whole thing a lot. That means the people can clip their Jumar in, start climbing, and just follow the Jumar. Your level of knowledge about orientation, of taking self-responsible care of route finding comes to a pretty low minimum nowadays.
Do you find, to a certain extent, that that puts you and other climbers at risk, like mountain guides, if there are so many people in the way, present, possibly injuring themselves or others?
On the very strongly visited 8,000-meter peaks, like Mount Everest, in the meanwhile, also on K2, but also on some of the lower ones, like Broad Peak or also Nanga Parbat in the meanwhile, which is very popular. There are so many climbers that they just the sheer amount of climbers reduces the speed for all the others. That means if you try to climb in a more or less honest, proper way without supplemental oxygen, you are just too slow in these queues. The people almost put danger on themselves by queuing on these mountains. Perhaps you remember this picture, which I took in 2012 from the Lhotse phase, where you see about 300 climbers, one close in front of the others. And I published this picture there at times for kind of warning the people how dangerous it is to climb Everest under such conditions with so many other people at the same time. But the picture was misunderstood. The people thought that if so many people can do it, I also can do it. Even if I don't have any knowledge. So it just happened the opposite of what I was intending with this picture. But I still have some hope that people learn to handle this situation with so many climbers at the same time. And I hope also that the responsible administrative organs, like in Pakistan, the tourism, the mountaineering and tourism office, or in Pakistan, the Ministry of Tourism, that they are reacting in a proper way and try to find rules how to prevent that too many people are climbing all on the same day, like last year on K2 when about 150 people were heading towards the summit.
That seems almost inconceivable from my perspective, thinking of K2 as such an almost unreachable mountain. You often see it as only the mountain that a complete expert would climb, and it's so hard to imagine. And I also wonder how such an extreme and also very delicate environment is affected by so many people being there in that space.
Well, your first question, if I understand right, is about K2, how it came to that point that so many people are climbing there nowadays. The Pakistani expedition market was more or less taken over by Sherpa expedition organizers. They brought the same style like they have on Mount Everest, now in the meanwhile also to K2. And same like on Everest, they fix ropes from the very beginning, from advanced base camp to the very summit. And I would say until 10 years ago, it was pretty much clear that when you climb K2, you do it without supplemental oxygen, and you try to climb as much as possible in a way which is not too hard on the environment. That means the amount of comfort you have in base camp, the amount of fixed ropes you are fixing is just in a way which is still a kind of acceptable. With the ethics of the Sherpas to approach high altitude climbing. In the meanwhile, there are these big dome tents also in base camp of K2. That means huge tents, where is even a barista, a huge coffee machine, so that you can get in base camp at any time a latte macchiato, a cappuccino, a coffee. It's so comfortable. You have big kitchens which provide amazing food. It became very comfortable, but I ask myself if this is still mountaineering and if this is environmentally acceptable, because so many porters have to go nowadays to these mountains. There are no proper possibilities for going to the toilet on the way to K2 base camp. In base camp, there are still no really good solutions for going to the toilet. And I think it's just a little bit overdone what is happening now, not regarding the ethics of mountaineering.
That's really interesting, because I think certainly when I was growing up, mountaineering was often seen as a sport that was very environmentally friendly. And talking of the environment, we see a lot of people online, and particularly here in England, where there aren't many mountainous areas, for example, and they don't understand climate change because they can't see it. I wonder, what's your experience of climate change, and does it make mountaineering risky?
Oh, it makes mountaineering way more risky. Let's start perhaps with the Alps. In earlier times, it was usual to climb, for example, Mont Blanc from mid of June, July through August into September. In the meanwhile, it became already by the beginning of the season, because of the warming of the glaciers, of the snow cover, it became so dangerous because mostly this season is different. We have still a lot of snow in the mountains, but on average in the last 10 years, the snow cover is way less. Very soon the blue ice is coming out. Very soon rockfall starts because there is no snow coverage. The permafrost is melting, and so there is a lot more rockfall than in earlier times. I remember um, just recently I was in the Mont Blanc area climbing on Grand Capucin. We had our tent standing underneath Grand Capucin between Tourande and Grand Capucin. And during the day, we heard all day long rockfall from all sides. And the people just can't imagine how big is the amount of rockfall in the meanwhile on all the regular routes. I don't want to say on the normal routes, but even on the very difficult route, there is so much rockfall that these routes in the meanwhile often can only be climbed in spring or during winter. So what has been a usual summer climb in the meanwhile has changed completely towards spring or winter.
That's really interesting. And I guess I've noticed that somewhat in the Alps. When I used to visit in the summer, there was more snow on the Eigerman Jungfrau than there would be now in sometimes parts of winter and autumn, which just surprises me no end. And you sort of almost forget what it used to look like. It just sort of fades.
Let's look at another example. For example, you speak about the Jungfrau Eigermönch. When you descend the Jungfrau and you get to the Concordia place, it once was 800 meters thick, the ice at the Concordia place. And there started some ladders to get up to the Concordia hut. And these ladders were about 150 meters high. In the last few years, every year, the hut wardens and the Alpine Club section who is taking care of the huts, they have to add ladders. And I remember that in the last few years, there were added at least 100 meters. Or I can't tell you proper numbers right now, but at least 100, I think even 150 meters of the ice on the Concordia place has melted. So instead of being before 800 meters thick ice, in the meanwhile, there is just perhaps 650 meters left. And if you look to the end of the Jungfrau, which continues over the Concordia Platz into the Aletsch Gletscher, every year there are hundreds of meters which are getting lost because the melting zone of the glaciers are rising according to the climate change, according to the climate warming. And it's foreseeable that in the next 50 years, we will not have any glaciers left in the Alps. And before it comes to that point, we will have so much rockfall and so many accidents from rockfall, you can't believe it. But I don't want to talk only about the Alps, but also about the Himalayas, for example. Let's take the most well-known example, which is Mount Everest. The last day to walk to the base camp of Everest is from Lobuche at 4,900 meters to the base camp. I give you immediately an example of Lobuche. Lobuche in earlier times, let's say 30 years ago, was about at the same height like the Kubu Glacier flowing down. You had to climb a little bit on the moraine from Labuche, and then you descended a few meters, perhaps 30 meters, and you were on the glacier. In the meanwhile, you have to climb down almost 200 meters to get on the glacier. It's about the same like when you are in Chamonix and want to go on the Mer de Glace. So it's not only connected to the Alps, it has arrived in the Himalayas since a long time. The only problem is in the Himalayas that most of the rivers originating in the Himalayas, at the high mountains, they are feeding millions and millions of people in India and in other places, in Nepal. And if these glaciers stop flowing, there will also be no more water sources for the people who are living there, and many other things.
So not only is mountaineering riskier perhaps than it's ever been, but mountaineering is widely recognized to be an extreme sport. And usually we see someone who engages in extreme sports as someone who has an extremely strong mind. And I wonder what makes your mental state different to perhaps a non-mountaineer or a non-extreme sports person? And is your resilience born, or is it sort of created? Is it something you have to learn?
Well, I don't want to make us special, or I don't want to say mountaineers or extreme sportsmen have better or more interesting experiences. But for sure, we have learned to battle with a lot of difficult moments in our life. We have really chosen to go to environment which is harsh, which can be very, very harsh at times, and we of course have to handle that. That means we do not only have to handle these difficult situations, but we also have to anticipate what will happen in 2, 3, 4 days, and we have to take the right decisions. When we are on the mountain, we have to return early enough to be safe. We have to always think ahead. We have to think ahead. Whatever we are doing, every second, every few seconds, we have to think: how are our partners? How are we doing? How is the route? How is the weather? How is the avalanche situation, and so on? So we constantly are in a process of taking decisions which are life-saving, and I think this is shaping us. This is shaping our personality. Constantly being aware of where we are, what we are doing, that what we are doing stays safe. And I think that this has big influence on our development, and also on how we approach life.
It's very interesting because I've heard psychologists in the past say that there are people who will hide from the world and hide from life, and then eventually life comes and finds them. Or there are the people who go out and seek life and they learn to handle it on the way. Do you agree with that? Do you notice that in your life?
I would fully agree. We choose to spend a lot of time outside. We choose to be under these really harsh conditions, but you also have to learn to handle this. And I feel most alive when I'm outside. When I'm, for example, climbing in Patagonia, the wind is blowing. From one second to the other, there might be a wind gust which is blowing you over. So you adjust your walking, your climbing, of course, and you feel so much alive in these moments. In many other situations in normal life, it's almost a kind of boring. I don't want to call normal life boring. There are so many other challenges in life than only mountaineering, climbing, getting along with the weather and the conditions. But usually being on an expedition or being on a big climb, life is very, very intense. And this is what we are searching for. It makes us feel alive, and it makes us feel to get along with the situation, to be able to handle the situation. We need to be careful. I also want to point out that we need to be careful not to overestimate our abilities to get along with these situations. Otherwise, we run very quickly into dangers we can't handle. Mankind is made in a way that we always want to extend our progress. We don't like to stay on the same spot. We like to develop. We like to put our limits, our borders a little bit further. And so it's also important to keep your personal limits at a close look.
Makes a lot of sense. I wonder, particularly with my generation, there are people who suffer with climate anxiety. And so they don't know how to handle the feelings of not knowing what the future is going to look like, and how this issue is going to be solved. And I wonder, as you have the knowledge of climate change and also a fantastic mental resilience, what would your advice be to those people?
I'm a very positive person. I think otherwise I wouldn't go for mountaineering and high altitude climbing. So I usually try to see always the good sides of everything, the positive sides. And one positive side is that our planet Earth will survive by any means. If mankind will survive in the future, that's another point. And I understand that a lot of young people who still have the whole life in front of them, that they are concerned. And I would like to tell them one thing at first is to look for your own behavior, not always looking for politicians or to look for others to change things, but change things on your own side. Look, how are you warming your house? What kind of vehicle are you using? What kind of journeys are you making? Are you taking part in the global warming? Are you taking part in all the CO2 which is burned? And I think it's really important first to look on our side and then do whatever is possible on our own side, and then only start looking for the others and blaming others. And of course, it's important to try to change things also on a global platform. But first of all, I always think we should first have to look at our own impact. As a second step, I think people should try to be positive, try to put as much pressure on their governments but only in a second step, try to change policies which have to be made for the big companies who usually who have the biggest CO2 output. That these companies get rules, pretty clear rules, that they have to rethink their output of CO2, that they really change. In Germany, in the meanwhile, we have almost 60% of renewable energy in what we are using. We don't have our own nuclear power stations anymore. I have to admit, we are still using nuclear power, which we are importing from France, for example, or from other countries. But with the heavy commitment to live with also some disadvantages, with some problems, and with some moments where we have to find solutions for everybody. At the moment, we are on a really good way to get to a carbon neutral stage in hopefully 15, 20 years. We have to keep the pressure high on our governments, because they are those who finally have the biggest influence on the big companies to change their way of overusing our resources.
I wonder also what your advice would be to young people who would like to go into mountaineering. So people who might aspire to be a climber or a climbing guide. What might they need to have in mind as mountaineering is now changing?
What I see at the moment is that a lot of young people, they go to the climbing gym, they learn climbing on plastic holds in 4, 5, 6 colors. And this is really fun climbing, but it has very few in common with the climbing outside. And so I think if you can start climbing outside as early as possible, to learn about the weather, to learn about the fragileness of rock, about how dangerous can be to go on a big climb when the weather is not safe. All these moments, for all these details of mountaineering, they are difficult to learn and they need a lot of time and a lot of commitment. So if people want to go for, let's say, real mountaineering, they might want to start as early as possible, because when you're already in your 30s or older, it's difficult to get this special feeling also for nature, to develop a seventh sense which you need for mountaineering.
That's really interesting. I think I've heard a few times from people that particularly when you're young and you get to know nature's behavior, you learn to respect it much quicker. Whereas perhaps if you live in a situation where everything's very well organized, you almost don't perceive those risks to the same extent, I think, which is really
from most alpine clubs, whether it's the British Alpine Club or here in Germany or in other places, all these alpine clubs, they offer courses. If people don't want to go with other people in a course, they can hire a mountain guide, can learn all these skills. But what is very important is, after learning these skills, it's important to get self-responsible, to be really responsible for what you are doing. As long as you are not being able to understand the consequences of what you're doing, you will never get let's say, a surviving mountaineer. And there is this old saying, only a only a living mountaineer is a good mountaineer. Only an old mountaineer is a good mountaineer.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, actually, because I guess there are lots of forms of climbing which are so much more dangerous, like free soloing, for example, or solo alpinism. And we see a lot of that now, and that's really what draws a lot of people sometimes in, and they think, oh, this is so awesome. But I think it's very interesting that a lot of those individuals often don't know what climbing is like to begin with, to really appreciate how dangerous or how careful somebody needs to be in a situation like that. I wonder what your take is on the increase of free soloing and solo speed mountaineering. It seems to be a more modern concept. What do you think about
Free soloing or solo mountaineering is the most dangerous part of alpinism, of climbing. And I would never, ever recommend somebody to go free soloing. Of course, when Alex Honnold gets an Oscar for his film about climbing on El Cap, free solo, a difficult route, it's nice to see that a mountaineering gets so much attention to even receive an Oscar. But on the other hand, I think it's not a really good example for young people. I don't want to lift my finger and say you shouldn't, as a very popular, well-known mountaineer, you shouldn't go for free climbing. Everybody should be free in mountaineering to do what they want. But I think it's a little bit ill-fated to honor these free solo climbs by such awards, because for me it doesn't make sense. It's for me a kind of the most valuable what we have is our health and our life, and this is putting life into too much risk. I have seen so many people dying on free soloing in the last 50 years since I follow the development. The problem nowadays is for young people that it's difficult to find the attention of sponsors. The level of mountaineering is so high, and it's very difficult for the outside public to understand what's going on in mountaineering. And there are a lot of young people who think they can get more quickly well known through solo climbing, to do very spectacular solo routes, which they can post on the social networks. But it's the wrong way. I promise you, it's the absolute wrong way, because you are so close to death on these solo climbs. It's just too dangerous. I understand that young people want to stick out of the crowd and want to find sponsors for their doing, for really expensive expeditions. But nowadays, there are so many possibilities to do outstanding things still in the Alps. When you go with a friend and do a speed ascent of the 10 4,000-meter peaks in the Bern Alps, nobody has ever done this before. And this is only one little example. If you find your own projects, your own ideas, what you can do to show that you are really fit, that you are outstanding, there are so many possibilities in the Alps, or in the country where you are living, that you don't need to travel to the Himalayas for finding out that that you are finally dead because of you were climbing free solo.
Yes, I think that's something that seems to be very overlooked because it sort of paints mountaineering a bit strangely, and I think and climbing, but it also is so focused on social media attention, like you mentioned, and I do think that's a problem. I guess we see it with every profession, that your music has to sound perfect and your climbing has to be out of this world, and everything you do must have this pizzazz. And I wonder if people can get lost in that and actually lose some love for the sport that they had.
The problem is a little bit that most people with less knowledge or with less experience, they don't understand how difficult it is to be so safe in what you are doing when you decide to go for free solo climbing. Let's take, there is a Belgian guy, he just traversed the Paine Towers, from the southern Paine Tower over the other Paine Towers in Chile. It was an amazing thing. He belayed himself in parts, but he also did a lot of free solo climbing. Otherwise, you couldn't do this in such a short time. He took a huge risk, but he is climbing on such a high level that probably for him it's okay. But for somebody from outside who doesn't have the ability to judge what he is doing, it looks like, I can do this also. And it's motivating to see these things, but it's very difficult to understand what is behind, how many years of hard training is behind to come to this level, that Alex Honnold can free solo climb in front of the cameras such a huge phase, like or difficult route on El Cap.
That's just incredible. And I think it's so important to make clear exactly what the real risks with mountaineering are and how to stay safe out there and to have a good time in the Alps or the Himalaya, and to have a proper reconnaissance, as you mentioned, with understanding avalanche and rockfall risk, and having mountain guides or studying properly to become a guide. And those things I think are so helpful to young people who are seeing so much extreme content in the world, that actually there are varying ways to go about one thing, and that's a positive. And I'm really grateful for you coming along and speaking with me about it. I think it's extremely helpful.
Happy for that.
Thank you so much.
Sure.